I don't see Christina. So if you can connect Christina to say that now the problem is solved for the sharing screen. And so I give the floor to Angel. And after Angel, we will have Christina. So sorry for this problem. And we start again. And now we have this screen being shared. So Angel, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Madame Arenas, for organizing this event and also, of course, for the invitation to the Endocrine Society, which I'm representing here, to participate in it. So could I have the full screen? I don't know if otherwise we can continue like this if you see the slides well. Okay, well, so I'm here. Can we go to the second slide, please? Sorry, but Basil, could we go to the second slide? Thank you very much. So I'm here, as I said, representing the Endocrine Society, which is the largest society dedicated to hormones. We have over 18,000 members from all over the world. And the society has tremendous concern about environmental issues and is committed to excellence in hormone science and incorporation into patient care and public health. And from the very beginning of the endocrine disruptor issue, we have been working also to translate the science to the general public and stakeholders in general. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, in 2015, we published the second Endocrine Society scientific statement, where we review more than 1,300 studies, and we arrived to the conclusion that there are enough evidence to causal links of endocrine disruptor exposure to this list of different pathologies: the thyroid gland dysfunction, neurodevelopmental and neuroendocrine system disruption, obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease, female reproductive health, male reproductive health, and hormone-sensitive cancers in females and males. Can I have the next slide, please? In the society, we are very much aware that we are all exposed to a cocktail of many different chemicals that work as endocrine disruptors. They are in many daily products, and exposure is very widespread. Indeed, we know very well that endocrine disruptors are a special problem, and they are not classic toxics. And this is something that I'm going to emphasize in my next slide. Next slide, please. So here you can see a scheme where we have how a classic toxic works on the left side of the slide. And a classic toxic works at high doses, and they work through non-specific mode of action. And this is why they produce a massive cell death and increase acute morbidity and mortality in animals. If we go to the right side of the slide, we can see that endocrine disruptors work in a completely different manner. They work at low doses, affecting us at all ages, but especially during pregnancy and during fetal development and infancy as well. EDCs work at low doses because they imitate or block the action of hormones. So they work through an endocrine mode of action. And this means that they alter gene expression, They produce cell morphology changes and also changes in the function of cells. So these are subtle effects that we don't realize. It's not like what we have with a high toxic, okay? But this produces a causal role in disease occurrence and the increase in disease prevalence. So what EDCs do is to increase our predisposition to the diseases that I mentioned 2 slides before. And now I'm going to concentrate in the mode of action because it's very important to explain some of the characteristics of endocrine disruptors. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, how a hormone works. A hormone initiates its effects by binding to a specific protein in the cell that we call receptor, here in green and blue. In this case, is an example from experiments that we have published in my laboratory around 20 years. And so the hormone normally initiates these effects through this specific protein, and you can see that it triggers a signaling cascade. Okay, all this signaling cascade has a name and is to produce a signal amplification in such a way that one molecule of a hormone can increase, in this case, the release of thousands of hormones of insulin in this particular case, okay? So the signal is very much amplified. And the same happens with the gene regulation. Only one molecule can produce an increase of significant number of genes by many times, okay? So signal amplification is what happens with these signaling cascades. And what endocrine disruptors do, endocrine disruptors imitate the hormone. So they bind to the same specific protein and either potentiate the effect of the hormone or decrease or block the effect of the hormone. And of course, the effect is also very much amplified in the case of an endocrine disruptor because it uses the same pathway as the hormone. And this is why they can work at low doses, and in this case, in the pancreatic beta cell that secrete insulin. In addition to that, the mode of action also explains other properties of endocrine disruptors. Can I have the next slide, please? So here, if we go to the left side of the panel, we can see how this mechanism can explain non-monotonic dose responses. For instance, here we have 1 nanomolar bisphenol A. This is the concentration that all in this call have in blood, okay? So 1 nanomolar BPA in the beta cell, we know that acts binding to his receptor and produces a negative effect at the endpoint that we see here, which is the entry of calcium. If we go to the high doses that we have on the right side of the panel is the binding to another protein for the hormone that produces the opposite effect. So we have a negative and a positive effect on the same endpoint. And if we go down, we can see in blue, in black, the effect that happens with the low doses. In red, what happens with the high doses. And when we add both, what we obtain, and is a non-monotonic dose response. You see a decrease, a U-shaped dose response, a decrease with low doses, and no effect at high doses. And this is something that we have published, and we know that this is one of the molecular mechanisms. There are others that explain non-monotonic dose responses. So they exist, they are here, and they can be demonstrated by molecular experiments as well. Can I have the next slide, please? The molecular mode of action also explains why chemicals of the same family produce the same effect. So here we demonstrated how other bisphenols, like bisphenol S or bisphenol F, have the same effect as bisphenol A because they use the same molecular pathways. They bind to the same protein that I mentioned a couple of slides ago, and they do exactly the same effect in gene regulation and alter the function, in this particular case, of the pancreatic beta cell. So EDCs with similar structure use the same endocrine mode of action and have the same effect. And now I'm going to move to a completely different scenario. Can I have the next slide, please? So here I move to human epidemiological studies. And this is a recent paper published a couple of years ago, in which is demonstrated in humans how the incidence of type 2 diabetes is associated with the BPA in urine, and how you see that there is not a linear relationship. It's also a non-monotonic dose response in humans. So here, of course, the mechanism is much more complicated, cannot be explained with the molecular mechanism that we know in cells, but they exist in epidemiology as well, and they are here. And in addition, if you see the title of that paper, not only bisphenol A has this behavior, also bisphenol S. So another bisphenol with similar chemical structure, and as we demonstrated in cells, using the same pathway, is doing the same effect in epidemiological studies. And then the Endocrine Society, with these results and many other, of course, states that, can I have the next slide, please? Low doses and non-monotonic dose responses exist and are a consequence of the endocrine mode of action of endocrine disruptors. Endocrine empirical studies indicate that a threshold cannot be established for EDCs. Thresholds are unlikely with continuous biochemical reactions. We must bear that in mind. Endocrine disruptors with similar structure use the same endocrine mode of action, and therefore categories consistent with weight of evidence are highly recommended. And indeed, can I have the next slide, please? The Endocrine Society recommendations for EDCs in the CLP regulations are the following. EDCs should be included as a critical hazard class in CLP, and they must be treated in the same way as carcinogens already in the CLP, because they have very similar properties as well. A separate class of suspected EDC should be included with regulatory consequences. And the third is stronger data requirements for EDCs are necessary in REACH to provide sufficient data for accurate identification of EDCs and CLP regulation. And we need an updated testing and screening method to measure more sensitive hazards, such as effect on brain development, immune system, that we are still very unknown at the very moment. And with this, I have finished. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Angel. I will give the floor now to Christina. I know that you are connected under the PIA name, so I give you the floor just now, and sorry for the issue, the technical issue. So you have the floor, Christina.
Thank you, Maria. And I'm sorry for all that has happened. And indeed, I'm not Pia, but she was kind enough to send me a link that actually worked. Mine, I think I turned into an attendee, so it was not working anymore. So thanks also for the opportunity to be here to present the state of play of the work that we are doing on the inclusion of new hazard classes for endocrine disruptors in the classification, labeling, and packaging regulation for chemicals. So we can move on to slide 2. The next slide, please. So I start here in terms of the context with the communication that the Commission published in November 2018 towards a comprehensive European Union framework on endocrine disruptors. And I do so because already there we had important calls and the recognition, for example, that we need a horizontal approach to the identification of endocrine disruptors across all relevant European Union legislation, and based also on the WHO definition. So already there in 2018, at the end of 2018, we had recognized the need to have this horizontal approach for identification. And we also recognized that we needed to have better information requirements to be able to identify the endocrine disruptors. Obviously, it's useless to say that we are going to have new hazard classes for endocrine disruptors if we don't have the data to actually be able to identify the substances. So, however, these calls that were already there in 2018 were taken on board and reinforced by the chemicals strategy. We can move on to the next slide. In the chemicals strategy that was adopted in October last year, we are building on an extensive evaluation of all our chemicals acquis in the EU, which is quite extensive itself. So we had a fitness check, the REACH review, and many other specific evaluations. We also had a fitness check of endocrine disruptors that is part of the accompanies the strategy as a staff working document, and where, as you very correctly mentioned, there are some important calls on endocrine disruptors. So in the strategy, we can move on to the next slide. What we are doing is setting a vision for how to handle chemicals for the future for a toxic-free environment to be achieved by 2030, where chemicals are produced and used in a way that maximizes their contribution to society while minimizing the harm to the planet and to current and future generations. And to achieve this vision, next slide please, we have identified in the strategy 5 building blocks. Two are mutually supportive objectives, which are innovation and competitiveness, and strengthening the legislation to achieve a higher level of protection of human health and environment, and 3 key enablers, which are the simplification and coherence, knowledge and science, and the international dimension, the global dimension. Today, we will concentrate more on the protection measures. So as I said, it's our goal that all chemicals on the market are used safely and sustainably. And we want to promote the substitution for substances of concern, those that have the longer term effects on environment and on humans. And we also call in the strategy to ban the most harmful chemicals from consumer products, especially considering vulnerable groups. So we want to build the calls in the strategy are not a revolution or an evolution. We want to build on the very strong legislation that we have in the EU, and in particular on 2 horizontal pieces of legislation. These are REACH and the classification, labeling and packaging regulation. And they should be reinforced as the cornerstones for regulating chemicals. The 2 of the calls that were in the 2018 communication of the Commission are retained in the and strengthened in the chemical strategy. One is the introduction of the new hazard classes in CLP on endocrine disruptors as a mean to identify these the hazards of these substances in the same way we identify the hazards for any other hazard category. So the same as we do, as Professor Nadal was mentioning, on carcinogenic, mutagenic reprotoxicity, but also any others, from explosivity to immunotoxicity. So we need to have these new hazard classes and treat endocrine disruptors like any other chemical. But and as well, we have the call to amend the legislation in REACH to reinforce the information requirements. And I think the seminar that we're having on 1st July will cover more that aspect. It's necessary to have that information to be able to actually operationalize, use the new hazard classes in CLP. And a very important call in the strategy is to the introduction of generic approaches to manage the risk from endocrine disruptors. So this is in particular for consumer products. This is an approach that we have in many pieces of legislation in the EU today for consumer products. We have it in REACH, we have it in cosmetics, in toys, in biocides and pesticides, and in particular we use it for CMRs, for carcinogens, mutagens and reprotoxicants, normally category 1. In some cases also category 2, but normally category 1. And what we are saying in the strategies, we have to have the same approach also for endocrine disruptors. So in a sense, following what Professor Nadal said, elevating endocrine disruptors in terms of risk management to the level of carcinogens, mutagens, and reprotoxicants. This will apply to consumer products, so we need to look into the aspects of REACH that look into consumer products, but also other pieces of legislation in the EU that are regulating consumer products will need to reflect this call and be amended accordingly. We can move on to the next slide. So, other calls that we have in the strategy on endocrine disruptors, I already mentioned the information requirements, but we also have the call to consider endocrine disruptors in their own right, substance of very high concern. Again, the same as we have with CMRs. Today, they can be identified, and they have been identified. Some of substances have been identified as endocrine disruptors, either for human health or for the environment, and the REACH following Article 57F. So it means that it has to be proven that they have an equivalent level of concern to carcinogens, mutagens, and reprotoxicants. So what we are saying here is that we should treat them the same as the carcinogens and mutagens and reprotoxicants, and they do not need to prove the equivalent level of concern, because we already recognize they have an equivalent level of concern. So they should be introduced as such with name in Article 57, and not rely on this proof. And again, also mentioned by Professor Nadal, we need to find, develop and have better uptake of the methods to generate information on endocrine disruptors, because this is fundamental to actually be able to operationalize the information requirements. So all it's like a cascade of needs, no, that we need to cover in order to be able to identify these substances, and then later on introduce the risk management measures to protect consumers and to protect the environment from exposure to these substances. If we move on to the next slide, we then go on to the introduction of the new hazard classes. So as I said, we've already started working on this even before the strategy, but of course the strategy gave us a new impulse, a new momentum. We discussed already in March this year the proposal for criteria with our expert group that assists us in REACH and CLP, where it brings together the competent authorities and stakeholders working on REACH and CLP. Our proposed draft, obviously, criteria, it's based on the definition of WHO, and we are already building on the criteria that have been developed for pesticides and biocides. The purpose, as I said, of course, is that it's because when it becoming part of CLP, they need to serve all legislation. So this is very important for us, and maybe a marked difference with the way that the criteria for pesticides and biocides were developed, that they were not looking at all legislation, they were only looking at serving the pesticides and biocides legislation. Here we are looking at serving all the pieces of legislation. So we can move on to the next slide. So we have some parameters that we've discussed, and we come to a conclusion, and this is the way that we propose to go. So first, to have two different classes, one for human health and one for the environment, because some pieces of legislation, for example, they only protect human health related aspects, whereas others focus more on the environmental side. So it would allow us to give a better risk management response. And also because we have seen, it is rare, but we have seen at least one endocrine disruptor that we have identified that is only an endocrine disruptor for the environment. So we may need to have this differentiation. The way, yes, this is what I've explained. The way that the downstream legislation applies may warrant this distinction. We also would like to have two categories, like we have for CMRs. So we will have a category. We propose to have a category 1 of known and presumed endocrine disruptors, and a category 2 for suspected endocrine disruptors. I think for us this is important. We've built on the experience that we have gained with CMRs. And we see that it helps get a better scientific response in the decision making. So deciding whether the substance is an endocrine disruptor for category 1 and category 2, it helps the scientists conclude, because sometimes they don't feel they have a strong evidence for the category 1, but they still believe that it should be identified as an endocrine disruptor, so they can use the category 2. It also helps give a better risk management response. As I said before, for example, in REACH, we ban the direct sale to consumers of CMRs on their own or in mixtures, and we focus on category 1. Okay, and this is a ban, generic approach ban that has been in place in REACH for a long time, and it works very well. It's very automatic, and every year we make an update of this ban. However, the piece of legislation like toys and cosmetics also look into category 2 because of the particular use of these products and the vulnerable populations they are addressing. So it's good to have two categories to be able to also give a more tailored risk management response. And another element that we have considered is to have new label elements to be combined with existing ones. So one thing that I think it's important for us is we would not want to have a new pictogram. The pictograms are aligned at a global level in UNGHS. So we prefer to use an existing pictogram that is already identified with similar properties such as carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, and reprotoxicity. But maybe through the statements already indicate the endocrine disruption properties. If we can move on to the next slide. So in order to get the new hazard classes in CLP, we need to undergo an impact assessment. In the impact assessment, we're basically identifying and assessing the expected effects of the various options. The impacts of CLP itself may not be so big because normally it's related to packaging and labeling, but we are trying to also find through the supporting study and of the impact assessment an estimate of the number of substances that would fall under the different categories in each hazard class. This could be useful for the impact assessments that other pieces of legislation are doing on how the introduction of the generic approaches will affect them. So we are not looking into those consequences. They will look into those consequences because they are the ones introducing the risk management measure. But through the study supporting our impact assessment of CLP, we want to provide an estimate of the numbers. And then we have a number of stakeholder consultations, obviously, not only with our existing expert groups, but also with other expert groups. We move on to the next slide, please. So the next steps for us, we're still discussing within the Commission, but also with experts. So we are having another meeting of the expert group on endocrine disruptors in September, and to discuss the specific points in the definition. Our proposal should come by the end of 2021. After we've come up with our proposal, then we will start. After adoption, we will start discussions at UN level to see whether there is any interest in carrying into the global system our endocrine hazard classes. This is not the first time it has happened. Also in the past, we had taken action earlier than globally, and then our action was taken up at the UN level. That's the case, for example, of the ozone depleting substances. So it's not the first time that we operate like this. And then, as I said before, all the pieces of legislation that they need to introduce the risk management measures, in particular the generic approaches, will need to be modified and take account of the criteria and create the link in order to introduce the risk management measures. So that's something that we are expecting will happen. There, the deadlines are for 2022. So they will happen a year later. So it's the deadline for REACH and for other piece of legislation. So thank you very much. And I look forward for the discussions, questions, whatever you may want to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. So now I give the floor to Pia, the right one. Thank you. Pia, you have the floor.
Thank you. And you can hear me? Shall I?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Can I try to share my screen, or will you show it?
I will show it just in a
minute. Show it. Yeah. Can you click on the total screen in the bottom of your picture? Then you can see the whole screen.
You should be able to share right now, Pia. Is it working or?
I can't. Yeah. Well, yes. Can you see it? Or?
Yeah. Great.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning, or good to all, and then thank you for the invitation to present the NGO view on ED hazard classes in the CLP. You already heard I work for the NGO ChemTrust, a charity working to protect human and wildlife from harmful chemicals with a focus on identification on and action on endocrine disruptors. And I've been working with endocrine disruptors for the last 20 years, mostly with the national strategy on endocrine disruptors for the Danish authorities. But back in 2014 and 15, I was as a content national expert to the European Commission, DG Environment, where I worked on the EDC file. I will start by highlighting my 3 key messages: that it's crucial to stop immediately the serious lack of protection of human health and the environment from exposure to EDCs, and that EDs should be identified in two categories reflecting the level of evidence for endocrine disruptions. And in addition, we propose a category for substances showing endocrine activity. And lastly, that regulatory measures for suspected EDs in category 2 are essential if protection is to be increased. So why are these 3 issues so important? Today, there is a serious lack of protection from effects caused by exposure to EDC. And you've heard this is due to lack of legislation covering EDCs in all sectors, and in particular, we have no horizontal criteria to identify the substances. And Henri Nadal has just shown the plethora of harmful effects EDCs can lead to, and we are talking about serious and irreversible effects. Moreover, if exposure to EDCs takes place during fetal development, the serious and irreversible effects are seen at birth or later in life. And even the next generations or generations can be affected. And all over the world, there is a rise in hormonal diseases and other disorders associated with exposure to EDCs. For example, breast and prostate cancer, infertility, obesity, and behavioral disorders, as well as effects in the environment. And this is really concerning and calls for immediate action. And many NGOs have long called for actions on EDCs, and ChemTrust is a member of EDC Free Europe, a coalition of 70 European NGOs working to stop human and environmental exposure to EDCs. Already back in 2013, the coalition called for actions on EDCs, and in 2018, the coalition set up 8 demands for a new and revised EU strategy on EDs. And we were grateful to see that many of our concerns were shared by European Parliament, and that some strong resolutions were adopted demanding minimization of exposure. Last summer, ChemTrust published a policy paper on new paths for EU control of endocrine disruptors, giving our view on how new horizontal ED criteria should look like and how EDs should be controlled in the various sectors. And you have just heard from Cristina de Avila that the Commission intends to establish new ED hazard classes in the CLP regulation. Originally, our approach was an overall ED legislation. However, we welcome the Commission proposal. And why? And this is because the CLP is a fundamental pillar in chemicals legislation. It identifies the intrinsic properties of chemicals, classifies them, and this is the basis for the further measures in all sectors, including downstream regulations in the supply chains. And this encouraged ChemTrust, HEAL, and Client Earth to launch a joint briefing this spring on how we recommend the identification of EDs under CLP should take place. Our proposal, very much like the Commission proposal, is based on the WHO definition and the current criteria for endocrine disrupting biocides and pesticides. To identify a substance as an ED in category 1, there must be adverse effects and endocrine mode of action, and a plausible link between these should be demonstrated. And this requires a very high burden of proof, and this is why only very few EDCs have been identified until now. But for many substances, there is quite a lot of evidence for the ED properties, however, not sufficient to qualify as a category 1 ED. Such substances should be classified as suspected EDs in category 2, as Christina also proposed. And please note, this is not a question on whether these have ED properties, but more about the position or level of evidence that is required to judge with certainty. Category 2 is reflecting that significant evidence for ED is needed, and that it will take a long time to provide this, and most likely also lead to the use of many more experimental animals. So we were happy to see the Commission proposal of 2 categories for ED. But in addition, we suggest a new 3rd category for endocrine activity. Because in contrast to other classifications, the mode of action should also be demonstrated for endocrine disruptors. It must be shown that the adverse effects are due to endocrine activity. So endocrine activity is part of the identification. And this is why we suggest a 3rd category for substances showing endocrine activity in specified test systems. Such category could be a tool to prioritize substances for their further evaluation of ED properties and to inform the companies and the public about substances that may have a potential for being endocrine disruptors. So why is it so important to have more ED hazard categories? First of all, it will ensure consistency in regulation, as Christina also mentioned. We already have the current approach for CMR substances with 2 categories according to the level of evidence. And we have already several EDs or suspected EDs that are classified for reprotoxic or carcinogenic in 2 categories. So it's logical and consistent to follow this approach for EDs as well. Some parts of industry already try to make a picture that a new ED category 2 will blacklist a lot of substances that are not EDs. However, we believe that this criticism is unjustified. This is exactly the same situation as for CMRs, and this system has worked well for decades. But really crucial is that many more substances will rightly be identified for their ED properties, namely as suspected EDs in category 2. And it must be stressed that despite REACH legislation from 2007, pesticides and biocides regulation since 2009 and 2012, including ED criteria from 2018, today only about 20 substances are identified as EDs. And to my knowledge, only recently the first pesticide was identified as an ED, although we know that for several of these, the function is precisely hormonal disruption. An international list points to more than 1,000 potential EDCs. This also highlights the urgent need for data on substances' ED properties. REACH does not even include specific data requirements for ED properties. But however, we heard that this work is ongoing to solve that. All EU data requirements should be updated urgently in order to adequately identify EDCs, and ED identification should be accelerated by screening substances for endocrine activity. But even if we identify all the suspected EDs in category 2, it doesn't really increase the protection level if category 2 EDs are not covered by regulatory measures. Because of the lack of data and test methods and the very strict ED criteria, only few substances will be identified as EDs for many years to come. So if we really want to increase protection, it's imperative that both EDs category 1 and suspected EDs category 2 will be banned in all consumer products. Toys, cosmetics, food contact materials, etc. And in addition, it should be considered to also include wide dispersive use. We have talked about EDs for more than 20 years now, and it takes 1 generation before all the effects of new regulatory measures can be achieved. And we all know how long time it takes to agree on and implement new legislation. And we have already lost nearly 10 years on arguing and delaying. We must not let down yet another generation. There is an urgent need for transition measures until all regulation is fully implemented. We therefore propose to establish a transitional ED identification and control based on existing classifications combined with information on endocrine activity. So I hope I was able to show it's high time to act now. ED identification should be accelerated by using categories. Suspected EDs in category 2 should be banned in consumer product. And already now we can ensure that REACH restrictions cover groups of endocrine disrupting chemicals, as Angel also asked for. There are strong forces that work to avoid more ED identification and thus control. But please remember, this is not only about our health and environment, it's also about high societal costs, and not least, it's about our children and the next generations, their ability to reproduce themselves and their brain development, and not least to forget biodiversity. So many thanks for your support so far. The European Parliament can really make a difference in ensuring new legislation that includes adequate ED identification in categories and control. Thank you for your attention, and you can read more at our web pages, and I've inserted links in the presentation for our policy papers.
Thank you, Pia. It was really interesting to hear from you three experts. Now we will give the floor. I know that I have some MEPs, and perhaps I don't know if Martin is there or Jutta or others. If you want to take the floor, you just have to take and to ask by raising hand. I don't know if I don't know, Basil, if you have people asking to have the floor.
Yes, I think Jutta has raised her hand, so Jutta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel, and thank you to Maria Arena for this seminar. I'm really happy that we are having this seminar at this point of time. I believe it is a food for thought, and also it means a very good push for the European Commission in the time when we actually also prepare for what will come up next year. And from my point of view, I would like to say that from the last intervention here, I could sign to all of these demands. I believe it's really important that we do everything that's been said about restrict groups of EDCs under the REACH. That is so important. We need to ban the suspected endocrine disruptors, of course, in consumer products. I would really like to see a horizontal approach here. I find it very disturbing that we can have so much of endocrine disruptors in our daily lives. And I have been shocked many times during seminars of how much it actually affects us and is part of the risk factor to get some of the very big public health threats like diabetes, like fertility problems. And I just would like to thank everyone and say that this is, from my point of view, something that we need to reflect more about in the environmental committee, and then make sure that we put these lessons into some action in the European Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Jutta. Basil, I don't know if Martin is there and willing to have the floor.
He had to leave because we were
a little bit late.
Off our time alignment. So I don't know if anyone else wants to take the floor. I don't know if our panelists can stay a few minutes. So yeah, please, anyone want to take the floor?
Yeah, waiting for having someone to have the floor. May I ask something to Christina? Because Christina, you talked about two categories that you are working on, and PI is proposing the third category. And so is it something that you are working on, or is it really something that you don't want to have in your proposal? So I don't know, perhaps you can react on what Pia was asking for on the third category. That seems to be really interesting also. And my second question is, when we are working in the REACH legislation, we often hear from the Commission that they decided to prolong some categories on product because they don't have enough evidence that there are it is not about the endocrine disruptor, but on the product having health problem, just like pesticide. How can you manage that for the endocrine disruptor? We are not going to have the same answer coming from the Commission saying that having not enough evidence you will continue to allow this endocrine disruptor to be on the market. So how is it possible to avoid this situation that we are living in the REACH legislation still now from some products? But I don't know if Basil, you have someone else asking the floor.
We have another question in the chat, so maybe I can read it and then panelists can answer to your question and this question as well. A question from Ivan Lenens asking a question on screening tests and data requirements, asking if you can describe what kind of data is accepted by the expert of ECHA and EFSA in their assessment. Is there OECD test guidelines or other kind of methods? For example, can we expect the next test of urine to be accepted even if they are not yet OECD validated?
Okay, I give the floor to Pia and after to Christina and after Pia. I don't know. Yeah. Okay, Christina.
Okay, so on the question on the third category, as I explained, generally we are basing our approach on endocrine disruptors, and this was very clear, at least from the environment side from the beginning, on the experience based on the CMRs, where we have two categories. We don't have three categories. The problem with a third category is that it's only based on the activity. So because there is no adverse effect, it's very difficult to then ensure that there are going to be risk management measures. So in effect, such category will all end up being like a warning list. It will not be a list to whom we can, it's not a category to which we can associate directly risk management measures, like we can do for the others. As I explained in the presentation for REACH, the generic approaches apply for category 1. For cosmetics and toys is category 1 and category 2. So there are possibilities to already take action, and as it was mentioned also by Pia, for some of the risk management tools already on category 2. Maybe not for all, in REACH we don't have it for category 2, but in others, yes. So that's quite interesting. And having a list that is not linked to risk management measures is something that we still have to consider whether that is useful in terms of the categorization. One thing that is clear for us is also the issue of the screening criteria, how we are going to screen, because we need to avoid, and I think on this everyone agrees, that classification has to be useful and has to allow us to not have overclassified substances or underclassified substances. So we don't want to have a lot of substances that we realize that we've screened and we realize that finally they are not going to be classified. And equally, we don't have to have too few substances classified and a lot of important substances that should be classified going under the radar. So that's why the discussions on the screening criteria are very important, because we need to get it really right where we are putting the bar. So that's the consideration with the category 3. In terms of not enough evidence and still being on the market, I think this is a problem. It's not only in REACH, it's in pesticides, in biocides, it's in most of the legislation that we have in the European Union. We have an ex post approach. Substances are on the market, and only if proven that they cause an adverse effect, proven that they cause cancer, whatever, then we start the process of restricting them. And then, well, first, then we classify them, and then we restrict them. And this is why action is so slow, because a classification, harmonized classification takes around 5 to 7 years. And then a restriction takes another 5 to 7 years. And the substance that has been classified and then is restricted has not just started being an endocrine disruptor or a CMR. It has been has had those properties since the first time it was used or created or manufactured. So then the response always comes too late. It's always, for me, it's always too late for a CMR or for an endocrine disruptor when it has been on the market. So for me, the strategy is really a last call of opportunity to continue with the system that we have today, an exposed system. If we cannot manage to become more preventive in our system, and that's what we're trying through the strategy, then the reflection, at least for me personally, is should we move into an ex-ante system? You assess and then you put on the market, and not the other way around. You put on the market, and then maybe if someone demonstrates that there is a risk, then it can maybe after 14 years be regulated in a good case scenario. So it's really, that is where the strategy comes from. It's a preventive approach we need to do better in terms of protecting human health and environment. We need to do better also in innovating chemicals. We have to have different chemicals from the beginning. And if we don't manage, then I think we really need to sit down and have a really strong reflection about whether our system works or doesn't work. But for the time being, we are committed to our system. We want to build on it, and we think it's still possible to work with it through a more preventive approach, as the one that we're proposing in the strategy. Should all the calls be implemented properly, of course.
Pia, you have the floor, and perhaps Angel, if you want to add something. So Pia, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I can really support what Christina just said. But I would say that when in regard to the third category, it was as I described. I mean, we try to invent some new things here where we actually have to show adverse effects and we have to show the endocrine mode of action. So it really, you have two elements to identify a substance as an ED. So it really makes sense to have, we already have all the test methods, or a lot of test methods for the adverse effects. So it's also reasonable to introduce some indications when we know there is some endocrine mode of action. So and this, I know this cannot be used for risk management measures, but I mean at least it could provide some new information, or so both authorities and companies can be aware that this substance may have a potential for being an endocrine disruptor, and that they can use it for substitution, as well as the public can if they want to avoid these sort of substances. So I think it's still a good idea because we have a lot of knowledge about substances mode of action. So why don't make this public?
Thank you. Angel, if you want to add something.
No, I think I agree with Pia in this very last point, and I understand as well the point of Christina with the third category. As a scientist involved in endocrinology, I think that the fact that a chemical modifies whatever in the endocrine system, this is a hazard. Or maybe a hazard. So it is not, it may be a hazard, and therefore it would be safer for the citizens to have a third category, although I understand the difficulty, you know, and the point that this makes, but certainly to demonstrate the mode of action takes years, believe me, and sometimes many years. So it may be helpful to think at least about a third category if it would be possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Angel. I don't know, Basil, if we have the time to have this last question on the US system and how to avoid duplication. I don't know if we had the time to deal with this question in the chat.
Yes, maybe very quickly, there's another question in the chat on the screening and test approaches, asking if this plan from the Commission or ECHA to have some kind of cooperation between, for example, EU and US regulatory systems, as the comment in the chat says that the US EPA is already well advanced with work on high throughput screening approaches. So is there any project to cooperate with these other regulatory systems to, for example, avoid duplication of efforts and be able to use data that is already there?
So I don't know if Christina wanted to answer. Yeah, Christina, you have the floor.
In the chat, there are a lot of a variety of questions on data and on tests, and maybe there, briefly, I don't know if I will be able to cover all of it. I mean, in principle, when we are talking about testing that is used for regulatory purposes, the tests not only need to be, I mean, we try to have internationally accepted tests, and that's why in the chat is mentioned the OECD test guidelines, and that's the tests that we are accepting are those that are contained in the test methods regulation, which is a daughter regulation of REACH, and are normally internationally recognized. So they have gone through the OECD process. That's because we want to avoid the application of data also with other countries and the regulatory frameworks. I think one of the questions that is posed in that list of questions is about the data that is used. And that's something that we are also looking into. Try to make sure, first of all, that the concept of available data is reinforced in our system. We're looking at this through the one substance, one assessment process to make sure that the data is transferable, is reusable, and we don't need to duplicate it. We see that already today we have some regulatory obstacles. So it's already in the legislation that we are not allowing some data, for example, from sectors such as pesticides or biocides to be reused in which. And for us, this data should be used by all the risk assessors. No? So ECA, EFSA, they should have access to all the data, because otherwise that's where we end up having different conclusions in the assessments, because they don't have the same starting point. So those are elements that we are looking into. It's a pretty tough work to map out all the data flows and where the obstacles lie. But our idea is to propose by, I think it's 2023, if I'm not wrong, an omnibus proposal that will try to eliminate all those obstacles to the data reuse. And that's one of the 3 proposals that we will have under the one substance, one assessment. The question of whether we can already move away from OECD into using other types of tests, we are also considering how, because we know that we need to advance also in terms of the tests that we have available, in particular for endocrine disruptors. I think all of us have mentioned that it's an area that we need to work on, because we can have the hazard classes, we can have the call for the information requirements. If we don't have the test to actually generate the data, it's almost like we don't have all the regulatory basis, no? But we will need to consider, how this all comes together. I mean, at the end of the day, the important thing for us is that they can be used for regulatory purposes. So they have been approved for regulatory use, the test. So not so much that they are OECD or not OECD. That's the advantage for the mutual acceptance of data. But it's important, not all tests are the same, and it's important that they can be used for regulatory purposes. So that's important for us. And of course, there is collaboration with, in particular, between ECA and EPA. There is a memorandum of understanding. And of course, there is collaboration amongst the agencies to try to benefit from the knowledge of each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much for each of the speaker from today's webinar. Unfortunately, I think that we have to leave now, and I'm so sorry for the beginning of this webinar and for this technical issue, but I hope that for the next one that we will have on the 1st of July, we will be totally ready to have this webinar. So thank you, Christina, Pia, and Angel. If we may, we can share your presentation, because it was really, really interesting to have it as a support. So we will share these information to the people that are asking for. So you just have to ask for it. And as you said, Christina, this horizontal approach that we discussed today will only be efficient to better protect people and environment if we have the correct information to identify these substances. It is therefore crucial that the information requirement to identify EDC are updated to be up to the challenge. This update of this information requires an annex of REACH, will be the topic of the second webinar next week on the 1st of July. We will be happy to welcome you again. And if you haven't registered yet, you can find the link in the chat right now. So thank you and have a good week. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.